Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at the TRN EMX, and they are calling it the new flagship audiophile dynamic driver flathead earphones. So before we begin, I do want to thank Linsoul for sending me the EMX and for supporting my channel. If you look on their website today, it's about $39.80. So if you look at the design of it, it's sort of reminiscent of how they described it. It is a flathead sort of earphone, not quite an earbud. It doesn't really hang down like an earbud. It actually goes around your ear with a detachable cable. This is the cable, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But they're calling this a 14.2 millimeter large size beryllium plated diaphragm driver. So you get almost see what's going on in there through the grill, but not quite. So the back does have a vent, and that is a real vent. They call it a half open back, I think is how they described it. The cable is TRN's modular cable, so this is actually a modular cable, and it comes with, I think, all 3 sizes. This modular cable is one they've actually distributed with a couple different sets, including ST5. If you're like me and ever wondered whether that was the same as TN8, it is not. TN8 is actually a little thicker cable. And if we look at them side by side, you can kind of see that the EMX cable is actually on the bottom, and the thicker TN8, the one that you buy for $10 or $11, is actually a thicker cable with slightly different gauge wire. So if you're ever curious if they were the same, the answer is no, they are not the same. So let's kind of jump into it, and we are going to go through this quite quickly. Simply because there's just really 2 different people who are going to be into the EMX. One, you're a TRN fan and you were interested in supporting TRN or just getting their take on a flathead earbud style driver, and that's cool. You've come to the right place. This is their new flagship. If you're an earbud fan and you were looking to see if TRN did something new, something great in an earbud style, maybe you have a Vito or maybe you have a Yincro and you were looking to see if you were going to upgrade to a nicer build quality in this slightly over-the-ear style, which isn't all that popular. Yes, it does that, but I think the trade-off in sound quality is probably not going to be something that you're going to be interested in. The extension is actually quite limited on this set, so if you're going from even a Vito or a Yincro, which are sort of a full range, everything just sounds quite good on those for those price. They're great values. This one is quite limiting. This one is very much mid-centric, and by mid-centric, I mean the extension barely extends beyond the mids, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. But yeah, I think we'll kind of spin through this one quite quickly. So looks great. I think it definitely looks great. I think it looked great. I think I got interested in this one just by looking at the pictures of it. I'm like, how did they really pull off this half IEM looking back with a earbud style front? Is that actually going to work for people? But I would say consider the comfort and fit in this over-the-ear cabled earbud style. I think I think I was more impressed with the picture than to actually put it in my ear. It's actually a little clunky to put it in your ear because it sticks out a little bit. The cable angle and how it holds it, the whole thing didn't quite feel as natural as it should. Not as natural as a hang-down earbud, and certainly not as natural as an in-ear monitor. So I don't know if it was the best of both worlds. It's sort of a clunky version of neither. So the back vent, like I said, is functional, and it's a nice touch, unless you want to really isolate yourself. I happen to type a lot when I'm listening to IEMs, or in the case of the EMX. And this one is sort of like listening to a TWS in ambient mode. Pretty much all the sound kind of travels right through the back, right into your ear. There's not much isolation at all. So functional vent, but the trade-off is not so much isolation. Sound, like I said, it's very mid-centric, very vocal-centric. Not a surprise because lots of earbuds do that style sound, and the stage is kind of a little bit flatter than I was expecting. Considering it had an open back and earbuds tend to sit outside of your ear, and it tends to be a bigger stage. This one, not as much. And I will call it genre-limiting extension. I don't have the graph. I probably should have printed the TRN graph, but yeah, this one rolls off very quickly on both sides, and so I would call that genre limiting because of the extension doesn't really go far but at the same time, very fatigue free. If that's something that really bothers you, there's not a whole lot of treble there to really bother you, and there's very minimal bass at all to bother you at all. So bass wise, I would just call it minimal. It barely extends out of the mids, right? It's a very, very short bass shelf, and it drops off very quickly, and there's sort of just enough there to support the mids. Instruments that need anything more than that are going to sound quite shallow. There's really no depth to it at all. There's no low end to most instruments. It's I don't know. It's minimal bass is what I will stop at there. So the mids, clean and clear. There's no bass to cloud anything up. There's no bleed into the mids. They're just clean, clear, sharp, detailed, and I think that's a lot of what, when TRN describes the audiophile style sound, I think that's really what they're talking about, is this real focus on the mids. Essentially, that's all that's there is the mids. But anyway, the mids are actually done quite well. If you don't care about anything else, then the mids are actually done quite well. So the first song that actually caught my ear, that actually had to stop and say, wow, that actually sounds really, really good, These Bones by the Fairfield 4. Perfect track for the set, right in the mids, just vocals, clear, detailed, transparent. Resolution actually sounds quite good. Stage has a good amount of width, and it just sounds a little bit close. It's like TRN close. They like to be kind of right at your ears, right at your eyes maybe. They tend to be a little closer sounding, more intimate vocals. But yeah, this was kind of the only track that really, really made me stop and pause and say, wow, these things can actually do something quite well. It's just hard to get beyond vocal-only tracks. It does those very, very well, but like I said, it's sort of genre limiting in that it does these well, but the rest of it not as much. So Weird Fishes from the Radiohead A Jazz Symphony version. I don't know why the stage tended to shrink very, very small on this one. Maybe it went a little deeper, but sort of without the high frequencies and so many instruments all at once, the whole thing kind of closed in and felt a little more, cramped, I think is what I would call it. The upper end sounds a little less than neutral. There's just not a whole lot of upper treble. It rolls off quite quickly. Not a whole lot of upper end there to really make the stage feel a little wider than it should be. And this thing kind of struggles with the mids on more complex parts. Anything that tried to compete with the mids, there's almost minimal bass, so that wasn't really competing with the mids. But what's there on the treble side tended to compete with the elevated mids, or maybe it's just the lowered treble. Either way, the levels were not quite right. So everything in the mids, kind of at the right level. Anything outside of the mids, too low, and it just competes, and you really couldn't hear it. So I would say that song, not bad, but kind of sounds like a darkish IEM with no upper treble. It's definitely all missing the top end of most instruments. And then you get to Bird on a Wire. So Jennifer Warren's Bird on a Wire, it's one of those tracks that's really hard to pull off on a V-shaped set. It's very easy, or almost easier to pull off on a mid-centric set, because there's heavy drums, nice treble. Her voice tends to float between on V-shaped sets, kind of floats right in the middle of the V. So it's really hard to get the levels all right. If there's too much boost on either side, it tends to affect her vocals. So it's a pretty good test for general levels across a pretty wide range, and how all the other instruments and singers sound compared to her level. And on this one, it's almost a deconstructed version of that song. There's just her voice. Her voice is at this level, and nearly everything else is way, way below her voice. It's very odd. It sounds very deconstructed. It's very, very vocal-centric right around her vocals. The drums essentially have no impact. They're kind of barely audible. The throat singers are very hard to hear, and if you're familiar with that song, you know that they're sort of prominent right in that beginning part. They have that throaty low end, and that sort of doesn't really exist on this set. And everything just really rolls down from her voice. It's very, very strange to listen to that track on this set. Very deconstructed is kind of what I would get to. But then you get to that part where it picks up at 220, and everything is just sort of missing the low end. The bass is really, really, really minimal. So there's just really not that low end to really have a foundation for the rest of the instruments on that track. So the treble-wise, what's there is okay. Some good detail shine through because there's no mid-bass. There's nothing to cloud up. The clarity and the transparency, it's got the clean and clear thing down right. If you call that audiophile style sound, they sort of nailed that bit. But, I think that's good, and they get a lot of detail on the treble and all that. Right in the beginning, I think Blink-182, all the small things. The vocals and the guitars actually sound pretty good. And then as you go a little further into the track, everything sort of smears together as the driver isn't quite keeping up with it. But beginning is kind of okay. So stage-wise, I think TRN likes a wide, close-in stage, and I think that's pretty much what they did here as well. This one definitely needs a little height and a little more depth, and it was a little more surprising considering it had an open back and it's an earbud style. I was actually expecting it to be noticeably bigger than it was, but it's okay. It's kind of a weird, maybe it's just the weird design that they pulled off and the way it sounds, or maybe it was the tuning, but I was expecting a little bit bigger, but it's okay. So there you go. There is the TRN EMX, and thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.